Everybody, I hope you are doing well. This is the first screencast that I'm making since we've started our quarantine. As you know, I've made a bunch of these in the past, and some of them are actually a little dated. But this is a new one. Looks like I just got an email there. No worries. So I'm going to keep this one fairly quick just to get us started. And what we're going to talk about today are the differences between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And if we think about this issue when we talk about civil rights in America, oftentimes we think of civil rights leaders as just being kind of grouped together. And it's an important distinction to make, especially when we think about the historical thinking skills that we focus on, that a lot of these civil rights leaders had real differences. So even though the bulk of today's presentation is going to be on Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, I'd like to do a little comparison, a historical thinking skill here, with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And although these two men were both civil rights leaders, they had very different views on how to achieve those goals. So Martin Luther King Jr., of course, most people are familiar with, believed in nonviolent civil disobedience. That was actually part of his strategy. His strategy was to curry favor with mainstream America by showing that African Americans were the victims of this horrendous practice. Whereas Malcolm X was less willing to support that policy. He was famous for saying that it is criminal to teach a man who is the constant victim of abuse not to defend himself. So both of these guys are great African American leaders, great civil rights leaders, but they had very different techniques for trying to achieve full equality. With that in mind, oh, by the way, the two men who oftentimes were compared to each other and oftentimes discussed together only met one time. And this is a picture of that famous meeting. And boy, there's a lot of stories there, but I'm going to move forward. One of my goals today is to keep this fairly quick. So with that in mind, when we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, it's a way of thinking about them that although they're both civil rights leaders, they had very different views on how to achieve full equality. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. Another really interesting story. He actually submitted his application keeping his race a secret and was admitted when he showed up. Harvard, to their credit, I guess, accepted his admittance. He is one of the founders of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that this group is still around today, but their name is so dated, right? Like we would never use that expression today. It kind of illustrates how long the NAACP has been around. He believed in racial equality. Now, this is the part of the presentation where I'm expecting you to be like, yeah, no duh. But as we're going to see, Booker T. Washington, and it's not that he didn't believe in racial equality, but he wasn't as willing to put that on the forefront of his demands. And you'll see what I'm talking about with that in just a second. Now, the little catchphrase to know about W.E.B. Du Bois, a little mnemonic device that will help you remember and perhaps will even come in handy if you have a question on this, is the talented 10th. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that 10% of African Americans needed to achieve positions of authority. 10% needed to become doctors and lawyers and civic leaders and business owners. And that talented 10, as W.E.B. Du Bois described them, needed to pull up the rest of African Americans, provide not only a model, but assistance. So W.E.B. Du Bois, a sociologist, the author of a number of very important books, was seen as being more radical of a civil rights leader. Now we have to put into context, because what you might be thinking right now is that doesn't seem very radical to me, right? But you have to put it into context, contextualization. What's going on in the 1920s? We talked a lot about Birth of a Nation. As you know, I like to use Birth of a Nation to teach Reconstruction. I also think Birth of a Nation gives us a great window into attitudes of the 1920s. So we see the rise of the KKK. This photograph always amazed me. This is the KKK, hoods off, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. It gives you an idea of how mainstream the KKK was in the 1920s. Um, with that in mind, oh yeah, just a few more. Libraries were segregated, schools were segregated. Segregation was the norm, not the exception. Oh, this one always gets me. I mean, think about this. Now, if you read, as you read this, this is horribly racist. And you might say, oh, well, racism is something that's out there. But look, reelect. This is what he's running on. And this is in the 1940s. So it gives you an idea, not that you don't know this already, but it gives you a sense of how radical W.E.B. Du Bois's ideas were when he was putting them out there. With that in mind, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington believed in this idea that now, if the talented 10th is the little mnemonic device that's going to help us remember W.E.B. Du Bois, that little green ballot is what Booker T. Washington talked about. That little green ballot. If I was in class right now, I'd be saying, who wants to take a guess what that little green ballot is? That little green ballot is money. In other words, think about that little phrase. In other words, we don't need to fight for the right to vote. We don't need to fight for full racial equality. What we need to fight for now is that little green ballot. And don't misunderstand that. I'm not saying Booker T. Washington didn't believe African Americans should have the right to vote or didn't believe that African Americans should have full racial equality. But what he was saying was we need to put economics first. Looks like I got another email. He is the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which did exactly that or worked to achieve that goal. So his attitude might be categorized in this way. So yes, it would be great if we had African American doctors and African American lawyers, but in the South and in other places as well, African American doctors and African American lawyers aren't going to be accepted. They're not going to be hired. What we need is to achieve economic growth in positions that are going to be socially acceptable. So become farmers, become carpenters, become plumbers, these jobs that pay well and are also socially acceptable. In other words, get your hands on that little green ballot. Um, Guess who was more mainstream? Now, this is where I think of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. If we look at Malcolm X is oftentimes described as being more radical. Malcolm X, I think when you look at what he believed in and the things that he said and you put it in a modern context, it's not that radical that people should defend themselves when they're subjected to violence and intimidation. But similarly, he was seen as radical during his day. Similarly, Booker T. Washington, when compared to W.E.B. Du Bois, was considered to be more mainstream. Famously, Booker T. Washington had dinner with the president. This was a big deal that this is during a time of segregation, and African Americans are certainly not eating with white Americans. I love this little cartoon of it with Lincoln looking on and equality in the middle. And similarly, try to find a picture of Malcolm X with the president. You're not going to find one. Whereas you can find plenty of pictures with Martin Luther King Jr. with presidents. Here he is with Lyndon B. Johnson. And here's an actual photograph of Booker T. Washington talking to Teddy Roosevelt. So it's an interesting comparison between the two, that more mainstream during their day. And as time goes on, I think we have greater perspective on what both civil rights leaders believed. What I would like you to do now or after this presentation is read Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. I provided a link, and I'm going to be giving you this PowerPoint to follow along with if you'd like. I'm going to click it right now and see if I can find a line for you real quick. I'm going to do that Control Find, and I'm going to go to this line. I want you to read the whole thing, but I'm going to highlight one specific line that I think is particularly interesting. So in his Atlanta Compromise speech, what does Booker T. Washington say? He says, "We shall stand by you with the devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives if need be in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interest of both races one." And here's the line: "In all things that are purely social, we can be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to our mutual progress." In other words, what's the compromise? The Atlanta Compromise. He is saying we will accept social segregation for economic opportunity. Now, what I would like you to do is I would like you to write a response as W.E.B. Du Bois to his Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech. What do you think W.E.B. Du Bois would say to Booker T. Washington? Write that response and include it in the PowerPoint. And I am hoping that we can have a discussion about it using video conferencing later in the week. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys, both virtually and through video conferencing, and knock on wood, maybe we'll even get to see each other again this year. I hope all is well.